The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant, the kind they used when they wanted a place to feel sterile, impersonal. Like no one had ever mattered there. I was standing at the far end of the table, hands folded so tightly my nails pressed half-moons into my palms, while my name glowed on the screen behind me. Except it wasn't my name anymore. It was followed by the word terminated. They didn't even ask me to sit. Greg leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, lips curled in that smug half-smile he practiced in mirrors. The board members avoided my eyes, except for Linda, who stared at her notes like they were scripture. No one spoke. They let the silence hum, thick and intentional. Finally, Greg sighed like I was the inconvenience. "Well," he said, glancing around the table, "this doesn't need to be dramatic." The room chuckled softly. My chest tightened, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood. They had already decided. This meeting was theater. Humiliation with a PowerPoint. "You're dissolving my equity," I said quietly. Greg shrugged. "You were never technically essential." That word, essential, landed like a slap. This was the company I helped build from my kitchen table. The logo on the wall. My design. The first client? My referral. The systems they bragged about to investors? I wrote them after midnight while my kids slept. But Greg stood there, perfectly calm, and spoke like I was a temp who forgot her badge. Security appeared behind me. I hadn't even heard the door open. That's when it hit me. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing me. I felt my face burn as Greg added casually, "We'll escort you out." Someone laughed. A nervous one. Or maybe not nervous at all. As I turned toward the door, clutching the cardboard box they'd already prepared, I heard Greg say it. "You should have known your place." I didn't cry. Not then. I walked past my desk, where my things were already gone. Family photo missing. Coffee mug missing. Even the plant I watered every Friday. What I didn't realize then was that the humiliation wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that they believed this was the end of my story. And as the elevator doors closed, sealing in the echo of their laughter, I thought the one thing that kept my spine straight. They didn't know what I had already done. I sat in my car for a long time after that. The steering wheel was warm from the sun, and my phone buzzed with messages I didn't open. I watched people walk in and out of the building like nothing had changed. I checked my bank account. $3,012.44. That was it. 5 figures of legal fees still pending. No severance. No equity. Just a carefully worded email waiting to be sent to clients explaining my departure. What Greg didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd spent the last year quietly documenting everything. Every corner they cut. Every regulation they bent. Every client complaint they buried. I wasn't planning revenge back then. I was planning survival. I drove home, parked in my driveway, and sat there again, this time staring at my front door. My hands shook when I finally opened it. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I placed the box on the kitchen counter and opened it. Inside was a notebook they missed. Black cover. No label. Filled with numbers, names, and dates. I ran my thumb along the edge and whispered to myself, "Okay." That night, after the kids were asleep, I opened my laptop. I didn't update my resume. I didn't apply for jobs. I opened a blank document and typed a single sentence. If they think I'm finished, they've misunderstood me entirely. What I didn't realize then, what I couldn't yet see, was that this wasn't rock bottom. It was the moment the ground stopped shaking beneath me. And somewhere across town, Greg was celebrating. He had no idea that 5 years later, I would be standing in that same building again, holding the keys. But first, I had to disappear. And I had to decide how patient I was willing to be. I didn't tell anyone what had happened for 3 days. Not my sister. Not my closest friend. Not even my kids, beyond a vague. Mom's working from home for a while. I moved through the house quietly, like a guest afraid of overstaying her welcome, answering emails with polite lies and reheating leftovers I barely tasted. At night, though, the truth sat beside me. $3,012.44. I wrote the number down on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to my bathroom mirror. Not for motivation. For accuracy. I needed to see it every morning, so I wouldn't lie to myself about how thin the ground was beneath my feet. What I didn't realize then was how dangerous hope could be when it wasn't paired with discipline. On the 4th morning, I finally called an attorney. She listened, hummed thoughtfully, and then said the sentence I'd been bracing for. "You could fight this," she said. But it will be expensive. And long. How expensive? I asked. She gave me a range that made my stomach drop. When I hung up, I didn't cry. I laughed once, short, sharp, almost hysterical. Then I tore the sticky note off the mirror and replaced it with another. No lawsuits. No safety nets. No shortcuts. If I was going to survive this, it had to be on my terms. I opened my laptop again and went through my old files. Not the ones tied to the company, but the side projects I'd quietly maintained for years. Freelance clients. Processes I'd optimized for others and never charged full price for. Problems I knew how to solve faster than anyone else in that building ever could. Greg used to joke that I was too cautious, that I moved slowly. What he never understood was that I moved deliberately. By the end of that week, I had my first client. Not a big one. Not a glamorous one. A woman who ran a regional distribution firm and needed help untangling a mess no one else wanted to touch. She paid me $1,200 upfront. I stared at the transfer confirmation for a long time. That night, I made a spreadsheet. Expenses. Deadlines. Targets. I calculated how long I could survive if nothing else came in. 91 days. That was my runway. I worked from the dining table while my kids did homework across from me. I took calls in my car. I said no to projects that smelled like chaos, even when my bank account begged me not to. What I didn't realize then was that restraint would become my greatest weapon. 2 months in, I heard through a former colleague that Greg was telling people I'd burned bridges. That I was difficult. That the company had been generous by letting me go quietly. I didn't correct the story. Let them think I was bitter. Let them think I was scrambling. Meanwhile, something strange started happening. Clients talked. 1 referral turned into 3. 3 turned into 7. They didn't care about my former title or why I'd left. They cared that I answered emails at midnight and solved problems no one else wanted to own. I raised my rates for the first time and waited for the fallout. None came. Instead, people paid without negotiating. By the end of the first year, I had replaced my old salary. By the end of the second, I had doubled it. Still, I didn't celebrate. Because every so often, I'd see the company's name in an industry newsletter. A press release. A smiling photo of Greg cutting a ribbon or shaking hands with someone important. And every time, something in my chest tightened. Not anger. Calculation. What I didn't realize then was that I wasn't rebuilding a career. I was building leverage. Late one night, while reconciling accounts, I noticed a familiar pattern in a former client's complaint. A corner cut. A rushed process. A short-term gain that would cost them long-term trust. The same pattern I'd warned them about years ago. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. They were still doing it. Across town, Greg was still confident. Still loud. Still certain he'd won. He had no idea that the woman he'd escorted out with a cardboard box was quietly mapping his blind spots. Or that my $3,000 wasn't just seed money. It was proof that I could survive without them. And once you know that, fear loses its grip. What I didn't realize then, what would only become clear much later, was that this phase wasn't about growth. It was about patience. Because the moment you rush revenge is the moment you lose control. And I was done losing anything. The first time I realized they were watching me again, it wasn't dramatic. No phone call. No confrontation. Just a question slipped into a conversation by someone who pretended it was casual. "So, are you still consulting?" she asked, swirling ice in her glass like the answer didn't matter. We were at a charity mixer. One of those events I used to attend religiously when the company still had my name on the website. I almost hadn't gone. Old habits die slowly, and shame dies slower. But I'd forced myself to show up, hair neat, posture calm, voice steady. "Yes," I said. "A little." That word, little, was intentional. She nodded, satisfied, and changed the subject. But the damage was already done. By Monday, 2 old contacts reached out. Friendly. Curious. Fishing. What I didn't realize then was how powerful it is when people assume you're small. I let them. I didn't update LinkedIn. I didn't announce milestones. I didn't correct rumors. When someone asked how business was going, I shrugged and said, "Busy enough." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, everything was tightening into place. I incorporated quietly. Built systems that didn't rely on me being awake at all hours. Hired one contractor, then another, both under NDAs so strict they joked about them. I didn't laugh. Every decision passed through the same question. Does this give me optionality later? That was the word I started thinking in. Optionality. Not success. Not growth. Not revenge. Choice. One afternoon, an investor I'd once pitched alongside Greg reached out. He said my name like it was an afterthought. "Didn't realize you were still in the game," he said. I smiled into the phone. Neither did I for a while. He laughed, then grew thoughtful. Asked questions. Specific ones. The kind that told me he was measuring more than my answers. When he mentioned the company, my former company, he hesitated. "They're expanding fast," he said. "Too fast, maybe." I said nothing. Silence is a mirror. People fill it with truth if you give them time. He kept talking. About delayed deliverables. Leadership turnover. Margins that looked good on paper, but didn't feel right in practice. When we hung up, I opened my notebook. The black one. The one they missed. I added a date. What I didn't realize then was that this wasn't about watching them fail. It was about understanding how they would fail. At home, life looked normal. School pickups. Grocery lists. Homework spread across the table. But at night, after the house went quiet, I studied financial statements like some people study maps before a long journey. Patterns repeated. Always do. They overpromised. Understaffed. Pressured managers to cut corners. Exactly as before. Exactly as I'd warned them. One evening, my phone buzzed with a message from a former employee. Someone I'd mentored. Someone who'd stayed after I was forced out. "Are you hiring?" she asked. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. "Why?" I typed back. Her reply came quickly. "I can't do this anymore. It's not what they say it is." I hired her the next week. Then another. Then another. Quietly, steadily, the people who'd once been loyal to that building found their way to mine. Not because I recruited them, because environments reveal themselves eventually. What I didn't realize then was that every person who left took something intangible with them. Institutional memory. Trust. Competence. The company still looked strong from the outside. New logos. New slogans. Bigger office. But inside, it was hollowing. I found out later that Greg had asked about me in a meeting. "Is she still around?" he'd said, half joking. "Or did she finally give up?" The room laughed. I imagined him leaning back in his chair, hands behind his head, convinced I was a footnote. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, city lights blinking like distant signals. I didn't hate him. That surprised me. Hate is loud. Impatient. Messy. What I felt was quieter. Confidence. Because while he was still performing certainty, I was building something he couldn't see. Cash reserves. Clean books. Loyal clients. A reputation for discretion. I wasn't chasing visibility. I was preparing for inevitability. What I didn't realize then, but would understand later, was that people like Greg don't lose everything at once. They lose flexibility first. And when the moment comes, when pressure finally arrives, they reach for the wrong solution. That's when someone like me becomes very useful. Across town, in that glass building with my old logo still etched into the lobby floor, decisions were being made without me. But the consequences? Those were already mine to collect. And the clock, finally, had started ticking in my favor. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, which felt appropriate. Tuesdays are honest like that. No false optimism. No dramatic flair. Just reality showing up when you're busy with something else. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code wasn't. I recognized it instantly. Muscle memory is strange that way. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice neutral. There was a pause. A breath. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years, polite, careful, strained at the edges. "This is Mark from," he hesitated, then named the company. "Their company. I was hoping we could talk." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. "What about?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "We're exploring outside advisory support." Advisory support. I almost smiled. What I didn't realize then was how hard it must have been for him to make that call. Mark had been one of the quiet ones. Competent. Loyal. The kind of man who followed structure because he believed structure was protection. Apparently, it hadn't protected him. We scheduled a meeting for later that week. Neutral location. No offices. No logos. Just a glass-walled conference room downtown that charged by the hour and asked no questions. When I arrived, Mark was already there. He stood when he saw me, hands clasped in front of him like he was bracing for impact. "You look well," he said. "So do you," I replied, which was kind but not true. He got to the point quickly. Missed deadlines. Regulatory pressure. A potential audit. Investors asking questions leadership couldn't answer cleanly. And Greg? I asked softly. Mark exhaled. Greg thinks this will blow over. Of course he did. I listened. Took notes. Asked questions I already knew the answers to. Let Mark talk himself into honesty. At the end, he slid a folder across the table. We'd like to retain you, he said. Short term. Discreet. I didn't touch the folder. I don't consult for companies I don't trust, I said calmly. Mark's shoulders slumped. I understand, he said. Then quietly, what would it take? There it was. What I didn't realize then was how satisfying it would feel to answer honestly. Control, I said. Transparency. An authority to make changes without interference. Mark nodded slowly. Greg won't like that. I'm not here to be liked, I replied. We ended the meeting without an agreement. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, staring into the dark. Not because I was tempted, but because I was curious. People like Greg never ask for help until they're already out of options, which meant things were worse than they looked. 2 weeks later, Mark called again. This time, his voice was tighter. We've had some developments, he said. I agreed to meet again. This time, Greg was there. He stood when I walked in, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something rehearsed. A smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Well, he said, spreading his hands, if it isn't. I met his gaze. He stopped. We shook hands. His grip was firm. A little too firm. A test. You've done well for yourself, he said, glancing at my watch, my bag, the quiet confidence I no longer bothered to hide. So I've heard, I replied. The meeting was tense. Greg talked a lot. Over-explained. Framed problems as temporary, external, unfair. I asked questions. Simple ones. Questions that exposed contradictions. By the end, his jaw was tight. So, he said finally, leaning back, are you in? I paused. I'd consider it, I said. Under very specific terms. I slid a document across the table. He skimmed it, scoffed once, then stopped. Mark watched him carefully. This is extensive, Greg said. It needs to be, I replied. Your issues are systemic. Greg laughed. Sharp. Defensive. You're asking for oversight, he said. Decision rights. Access. I'm asking for the ability to fix what's broken, I said evenly. And if we say no? I met his eyes. Then I wish you luck. For a moment, no one spoke. Greg looked at Mark. Mark didn't look back. What I didn't realize then was that this was the first time Greg had felt truly cornered. Not by regulators. Not by investors. By the woman he'd once told to know her place. We ended without a signature. But 3 days later, the agreement came back, revised. Most of my terms accepted. Not all. Enough. I signed it without ceremony. When I left the building that day, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the city noise wash over me. I wasn't celebrating, because this wasn't the win. This was the invitation inside. And once you understand the structure of something, once you see how it breathes and where it's weakest, you don't rush. Walking back into that building felt like stepping into a memory someone else had edited. The lobby was larger now. Brighter. New branding everywhere. A polished version of the same story, told louder. My old logo had been replaced, but the bones were unchanged. The angles, the sight lines, the way sound echoed just enough to make conversations feel exposed. Greg walked beside me, half a step ahead, pointing things out like a tour guide showing off a museum he didn't curate. We've grown since you left, he said. You'll see. I already did. Growth leaves fingerprints. So does neglect. People glanced up as we passed. Some recognized me instantly and looked away too quickly. Others stared openly, curiosity winning over caution. A few smiled small, almost imperceptible acknowledgments, like we shared a secret we couldn't speak out loud. What I didn't realize then was how much fear lives in familiar spaces when power dynamics shift. They gave me a temporary office. Glass walls. No nameplate. Neutral furniture. It was clearly meant to signal guest, not authority. I didn't comment. Instead, I asked for data. Financials. Vendor contracts. Compliance reports. Internal communications. Not summaries, raw files. When Greg hesitated, I looked at him until he nodded. By the end of the first week, the picture was clear. They were bleeding quietly. Cash flow problems masked by short-term credit. Client churn disguised as strategic exits. A regulatory issue buried so deep it almost looked intentional. Almost. What I didn't realize then was that someone had tried to fix this before me and been shut down. I found the emails. Time-stamped. Ignored. The same concerns raised repeatedly, each time dismissed with a breezy, "Let's circle back." I called Mark into my office. "This doesn't work," I said, tapping the screen. "You know that." He nodded, eyes tired. I told him. And he said we couldn't afford to slow down. I leaned back in my chair. "You can't afford not to," I said. Word traveled fast. By the third week, department heads were stopping by my office under the pretense of alignment. What they really wanted was permission. Clarity. Someone to say the quiet part out loud. I gave them structure. Processes. Boundaries. Greg didn't like it. He started pushing back in meetings. Interrupting. Making jokes at my expense. Testing whether the room still belonged to him. It didn't, at least not the way it used to. What I didn't realize then was that authority isn't taken. It's redistributed when people stop believing in the old source. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting, Greg followed me into the hallway. "You're overstepping," he said, voice low. "I'm doing what you agreed to," I replied. He scoffed. "Don't forget who runs this place." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "Do you?" I asked. The question hung between us, sharp and dangerous. That night, I updated my projections. If they followed my recommendations fully, the company could stabilize. Slowly. Painfully. But it would survive. If they didn't, I closed the file and stared at the screen. Survival wasn't guaranteed. And suddenly, I understood why this felt unfinished. Because fixing them wasn't the point. Understanding them was. What I didn't realize then, but should have, was that Greg wasn't planning to change. He was planning to outlast me. Weeks passed. Tension thickened. My recommendations were implemented selectively. The ones that required discipline were delayed. The ones that looked good in presentations were fast-tracked. Classic. Then the audit notice arrived. Not public. Yet. But real. I watched Greg read it, his face tightening as the room went quiet. For the first time since I'd returned, he didn't speak immediately. "This is manageable," he said finally. No one nodded. Later that day, Mark came to my office and closed the door. "We're exposed," he said. "Yes," I replied. "What do we do?" I considered him for a long moment. "First," I said, "you stop pretending this is temporary." He swallowed. "And then, I said softly, "you decide who you want negotiating on your behalf." He looked at me, really looked at me, like the thought was forming as he spoke. "What I didn't realize then," I added, "was how close you already are to losing control." Outside my glass walls, the office buzzed with uncertainty. People sense these things before they're announced. And somewhere deep in the building, beneath the new paint and louder slogans, the structure I once built was groaning under weight it was never meant to carry. Greg still thought this was a phase. Still thought I was here to help him. He didn't understand that I wasn't here to save the company. I was here to position myself for what came next. Because when a system finally admits it's broken, it doesn't ask the loudest voice for answers. It asks the one who's been quiet long enough to see the whole picture. And I had never been more prepared. The first offer didn't come from Greg. That should have told me everything. It came from one of the minority investors, a man who'd always spoken softly and listened longer than most people were comfortable with. He asked if we could meet off the record, which is another way of saying things are already on fire, and we're pretending they aren't. We met in a hotel lounge that smelled like polished wood and expensive denial. "I'll be direct," he said after the waiter left. "We're concerned." I waited. "The audit is only the beginning," he continued. "If this goes public, valuation collapses. Credit dries up. The board fractures. And Greg?" I asked. He gave a tired smile. "Greg is confident." Of course he was. The investor folded his hands. "We need options." There it was again. That word. Optionality. "What kind of options?" I asked. He studied me carefully. "How attached are you to your current role?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the glass office. The way people now deferred to me without being told. The way Greg's voice had grown sharper, louder, like a man shouting to convince himself he was still heard. "I'm not attached," I said finally. "I'm prepared." That seemed to satisfy him. A week later, the second offer came. Then the third. Quiet conversations. Side doors. Carefully worded hypotheticals. What would it look like if leadership changed? What would it take to stabilize the company without Greg? What would I need to step in more permanently? I answered honestly. Numbers. Conditions. Time frames. I didn't ask for revenge. I asked for control. What I didn't realize then was that Greg could feel it happening. He started calling emergency meetings, reasserting authority, making impulsive decisions that looked bold and reckless at the same time. One afternoon, he cornered me in my office again. "You're going behind my back," he said. "I'm doing my job," I replied. "No," he snapped. "You're positioning yourself." I met his eyes. "So are you," I said calmly. He laughed, but there was panic in it now. "You think they'd choose you over me?" I didn't answer. Silence is cruel when someone already knows the truth. The board meeting that ended everything was scheduled for a Friday morning. Greg arrived early, pacing, phone glued to his ear. I arrived on time. Calm. Prepared. They didn't ask him to open the meeting. That was the first crack. They asked for my assessment. Not his. Mine. I laid it out cleanly. No emotion. No blame. Just cause and effect. If they kept the current structure, the company would face regulatory action within 12 months. If they moved quickly, painfully, but decisively, they could preserve value. "And what does that look like?" someone asked. I inhaled once. "New leadership," I said. Greg stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is a setup," he barked. "She's manipulating you." No one spoke. That's when he knew. He looked around the table, waiting for backup. Found none. "What's being proposed," the chairwoman said carefully, "is a transition." Greg laughed again. This time it broke. "You can't be serious," he said. "This is my company." The words echoed in the room. I watched his face as reality finally arrived, uninvited. "You signed it away," I said quietly. He turned to me, eyes blazing. "You planned this." I didn't deny it. "I prepared for it," I corrected. They escorted him out the same way they once escorted me. No cardboard box this time. Just a stunned silence and a door closing too softly. What I didn't realize then was how little satisfaction I'd feel watching him leave. It wasn't joy. It was alignment. The weeks that followed were brutal. Layoffs. Restructuring. Hard conversations. I worked longer hours than I ever had before, not to prove myself, but because I knew what failure would cost everyone else. The company shrank before it stabilized. But it stabilized. 6 months later, the investor called me again. "We're restructuring ownership," he said. "There's an opportunity." I already knew. The numbers had told me months earlier. We met again in the same lounge. "This would require capital," he said. "Significant capital." I smiled slightly. "I have partners," I said. "And leverage." The deal took weeks. Lawyers. Negotiations. Late nights. When the final documents were signed, I sat alone in my office and stared at the city through the glass. I was no longer an advisor. I was no longer an employee. I was the majority owner. What I didn't realize then, what didn't hit me until much later, was that this still wasn't the ending. Because the building itself remained. The headquarters. The symbol. And every time I passed it, something unfinished stirred in my chest. 5 years had passed since I'd walked out with nothing but a box and $3,000. Now the final piece was waiting. And this time, I wouldn't be escorted. I would be welcomed. The purchase didn't feel dramatic. No champagne. No applause. No cinematic moment where everyone suddenly understood the irony of it all. Just a conference room, a stack of documents, and a pen that felt heavier than it should have in my hand. The building was listed as an asset. That's all. Concrete. Glass. Square footage. Market value adjusted downward after recent instability. No one mentioned the history. No one mentioned the woman who'd once been told to know her place. I signed anyway. When it was done, the attorney slid the final paper across the table and smiled. "Congratulations," she said. "You're officially the owner." I thanked her, gathered my bag, and stepped outside. The headquarters looked the same as it always had, imposing, reflective, confident. The kind of building designed to make people feel small when they walked in. I stood across the street for a long moment, watching employees come and go. Some of them knew what had changed. Most didn't. Power shifts rarely announce themselves. What I didn't realize then was how quietly the weight would settle in my chest. I walked inside through the front entrance, past the security desk where a new guard nodded politely, unaware he was greeting the owner. I rode the elevator alone, the hum familiar, grounding. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, I paused. This was where I'd once been escorted out. Now the space felt different, Not because it had changed, but because I had. I went into what used to be Greg's office. The desk was new, the view the same. I walked to the window and rested my hand on the glass. 5 years earlier, I'd stood in my car, staring at this building like it was a locked door. Now it was mine. I didn't sit in the chair. Instead, I turned and left the office, walking the halls slowly, deliberately. People looked up. Some recognized me and straightened. Others smiled, uncertain. A few stopped me to ask questions. I answered them all calmly. This wasn't about dominance. It was about presence. Later that day, I called a meeting. All hands. No speeches. No grand announcements. I want to be clear, I said, standing at the front of the room. This isn't a victory lap. It's a responsibility. Faces watched me closely. We will do things differently, I continued. Quietly, consistently, with integrity, even when it's inconvenient. I didn't mention Greg. I didn't mention the past. But everyone felt it. After the room emptied, I stayed behind, alone again. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought about the woman I'd been 5 years earlier, sitting in her car with $3,000 and a cardboard box, trying to breathe through humiliation. She hadn't been dreaming of revenge. She'd been trying to survive. What I didn't realize then was that survival, done well, becomes leverage. And leverage, applied patiently, becomes choice. That night, I locked up myself, walked out the front doors and stood on the steps, keys cool in my palm. Across the street, the city moved on. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued, indifferent to personal victories. I smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just satisfied, because the real justice hadn't been buying the building. It had been outgrowing the version of myself who needed their approval in the first place. They never apologized. They never admitted fault. They never had to. The power had shifted without permission. And that was enough. 5 years ago, they'd told me I wasn't essential. Today, I own the ground they stood on. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.